this morning. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Michael Golay, who recently joined RiverMead. He's a professor of nuclear science and engineering from MIT and is eminently qualified to talk about some of the broader issues in dealing with climate change. With no further ado, here is today's speaker, Michael Golay.
Is this on, folks?
Yes.
Except for sure. No, it is. So I'm. So as Bob said, my wife, Michael Ann, put your hand up.
Put your hand up. I was trying to decide to tell him to speak louder.
We came here in September, and so we're still new to the whole RiverMead community, as Bob said. And I'm speaking today following having run a course on energy and environment at MIT for the last 30 years.
We can't hear you. We need a microphone. We can't hear you back here.
Is your mic on?
Yes, it is.
No.
Yeah.
Let's see if
I can hear. Yeah.
Well, not hear you clearly.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob, you sure?
Am I in your way?
Try this.
Is that any better?
Yeah.
yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is a course that involves about 5 departments at MIT, which is by itself pretty unusual. And we've had a team of professors who are the lecturers on different areas. And it started out as an energy and environment survey, but over time, the student interest became much more focused on climate change and maybe what role they might play in responding to it. And so what I'm going to try to do today is give you the sort of understanding that we try to achieve out of that course. And it's not taking sides for any particular avenue to make an improvement, but rather to give more a comprehensive view of the whole problem. And I put it that way because I find that the way that we discuss climate change in the United States, and it's not so different in other countries too, is to treat it more like a beauty or a political contest, where you look at a few champions, you ask if that one's pretty enough, or do I prefer another one? And we don't get much integrated analysis. And that's what I'm going to try to remedy to some degree this morning. So these are the things I want to talk about, which is the mechanisms of climate change, which I expect are familiar to most of the people here. But for completeness, we'll put these things in. The potential responses, where in the United States, I would say our emphasis is on the 4th bullet that shows up here. There we go, which is innovation. Americans are often very taken with geniuses in laboratories, coming up with really good solutions. And the message I want to get across is that this is a much more complex problem involving geniuses, of course, but governments and so on. So the other things that I want to mention are policies, like, say, carbon tax, the need for international cooperation, because this is a really big problem, and you need everybody to pull together to the extent that you can. Now, I'll use a metaphor of the world wars, where if you think about, especially World War II, think about how that went. Basically, it was pretty much a stalemate for about 3 years until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, which I think was a big surprise to the Germans at the time. But it had the effect of creating a mood for cooperation and identifying leaders to get things to happen. That's been missing from what we've been doing so far. It's been more a random collection of different organizations and people who've taken an interest in the problem. And one of the biggest problems is infrastructure replacement. That is, the essence of climate change is that it's being driven by use of fossil fuels to meet many of our energy needs. And if you continue to do this, basically the story's going to have a sad ending. And what you need is to replace the existing energy infrastructure. This goes from power plants to cars to the ways we make our food and so on. And we don't have a lot of time to do it. And so this replacement thing is a real demand on capital and organization in order to get it to happen in a time that will be useful. So innovation is what you read about in the newspapers or on TV, but these other things are just as important, and if they're not tended to properly, you're not going to get to where you need to go. And where I'm going to move to next is where you need to go. And so on innovation, what we tend to focus on are the technological portfolios for meeting our energy needs, because what we're needing to do is get off of using fossil fuels. The three principal degrees of freedom are listed here, being the renewables, and we'll speak more about what that means. Nuclear fission, which has largely been the wallflower on the dance floor. But it's kind of a surprise, because if you look at it, the yield ratio to chemical reactions, which is what we rely upon with current consumption of fuels, is about 200 million per reaction. That's a big thing. If I would give you $1, you might say, well, thanks, maybe I'll buy a cup of coffee. Actually, I don't think you can even do that anymore.
Louder, Michael.
Okay.
Speak up. Speak up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's right.
It's fuzzy.
But if someone comes along and says, hey, I'll give you $200 million, do you think you would perk up? And that's what we really have
All right, but
in contrasting these technologies. So by choosing not to use nuclear fission, we're passing up one of the important opportunities to meet the goals that we have, and I'll come back to that. But I don't want this talk to come across as a sales pitch for nuclear power. I'm just trying to say, these are the facts, ma'am. And for those who are old enough, you'll remember Jack Webb and what was the detective story in Los Angeles? Dragnet. Yeah. See, everybody here will know. Sir?
What exactly are you comparing with this 200 million to 1 ratio?
A single chemical reaction.
Okay.
And they tend to be simple. And so the portfolio is as listed here: renewables, I'll get to that, nuclear fission, and synthetic fuels. One of the things that is neglected also is that you need substitutes for direct consumption of fossil fuels. And so some of the options for this, think about a village in India or Africa, where a lot of the energy needs are met by scavenging. People go out and they get biomass in the woods and bring it home and cook with that, things of that sort. If you recognize that 3/4 of energy in a country like the U.S. is from consumption of fuels directly. It's not the renewables, that's electricity. And with nuclear fission, that's also electricity. So where the innovation has been focused has been on electrical production from these sources. And so this other will need some considerable development. That's one of the messages I want to get across, where that's not happening at the pace that you would want. Okay, any questions? Right. Actually, I swore that I would take the questions at the end, so I shouldn't even be asking. Okay, so this is the basic physics, and I think most people here have a pretty good idea of it, but for completeness, I'll go through it. So what we have is a situation where heat coming from the sun doesn't get re-radiated to space after it comes through the atmosphere. Rather, it warms the Earth to a degree, and some gets out, but most doesn't. And the way to think about this is that we have a blanket around the Earth, which consists of the atmosphere, and in it, blanket materials, sometimes called greenhouse gases. And they are dominated by carbon dioxide, and this is mostly from consumption of fossil fuels. And I'm listing them here. There are other sources of carbon dioxide, such as cement making, but basically it's energy. sometimes it'll be brought up that carbon dioxide isn't the whole story for climate change, and that's true. There are other gases like, say, methane or nitrous oxide, and they have important strengths for insulating the atmosphere, but they don't have the persistence that carbon dioxide has. That's the thing to recognize about it. And so think of every day that we put a blanket in the atmosphere, and on tomorrow we put another blanket on, and that goes on and on and on and on. The important thing is that the carbon dioxide doesn't go away. What's emitted today will be around a millennium into the future. And people have identified ideas for removing this blanket, but my own evaluation is that nothing that's been proposed right now looks like it's up to the job. That may change, but that's the story right now. So if we go back to, say, 1990, we were at about 167 or 8 greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Today we're at about 470. And so the rate has been going up. And if we look at how many greenhouse gases there are, or rather non-greenhouse gases there are for a single greenhouse gas, the ratio is roughly 2,100. So the consequence is that you need a lot of energy to scrub the atmosphere. That is, let's say you're going to go with direct air capture is one of the methods that's brought up. So you have an installation, you blow air through it, you try to react it chemically to take out the greenhouse gases. You have to move a lot of air. And just doing that, getting the energy to do it by itself is difficult. And then once you remove the carbon dioxide, and I'm going to use this as a surrogate for all of the greenhouse gases, the reaction, the natural reaction mechanisms are weak. They're basically glacial and focus on mineralization and production of carbonic acid. And anything I say along these lines will, if you look at enough detail, has more to explore, but I'm giving you what I think are the most important points. So the thing to know, I think one of the myths is about climate change is that, okay, this is coming about because of human activity. So if you want to get it under control, what you do is change your activity. You know, it's sort of like a person with a drinking problem. If they cut back on Monday morning and keep it that way, maybe in time that will work. Well, the answer here is no, that's not the case. That if you want to stabilize global temperatures, to do that you have to stabilize I'm using CO2 as a surrogate for the greenhouse gases. You have to stabilize the concentration of the greenhouse gases, and as long as you continue to emit them into the atmosphere, the temperature increase will continue. And this is a really important point because almost all of our energy needs are met right now using fossil fuels in the production of greenhouse gases. You know, if you go down to over by the TD Bank, you know, there's a gas station. That's direct consumption of chemicals that will produce these gases. So today, the potential replacements for this are listed here, and I've spoken about them already. But the story gets worse. Let's say that you go totally cold turkey and you're going to find some way not to consume fossil fuels. The atmosphere will continue to warm up. And this is because of things that we've already done. And I'm listing here some of the things.
Yeah, we have sea level.
So the good news is, if you cut back on the concentration, the rate of increase will go down, but it won't stop. And so some of the things that occur are things like the warming of the surface, which can result in emissions from permafrost in the northern regions. Sea level rise, which is occurring because of a thermal expansion of the water in the sea and continuing melting of the glaciers. The slowing down of the ocean circulation that comes from basically cold saline water in the ocean descending and going in a conveyor in the ocean bottom And as fresh water comes down from the northern regions, this becomes weaker. The water coming into the ocean from the northern regions becomes less dense, basically. So, and this will be going on even if we don't consume any more fossil fuels. I spoke about the release of methane from permafrost and other organic deposits. That will continue as well, and there's a feedback. There is a decrease in the solar albedo, or reflectivity, of regions which right now are covered by ice and snow, but as that melts, they're replaced by dark water. So again, the feedbacks are all in the undesired direction. And shifting of biospheres is occurring, and we're seeing this around here, for example. The arboreal species that we have around here are, and those from the past are becoming less important, and others are coming in. And finally, acidification of the ocean from formation of carbolic acid. So the long-term effect is that the emissions, even if they cease, is that we will have the CO2 in the atmosphere will stay there, and the warming will continue to some degree, just not as rapidly as we've had. Okay, I hope that makes sense. It's not a happy story, but it's real.
No.
What's that? Okay,
She agreed with you.
that's good. Okay,
Well,
so,
I thought you said that in an earlier slide, that if the CO2 concentration stabilizes, the global temperature will stabilize.
except for the
But
minor
this last
feedbacks.
slide said that it'll still continue.
That's right.
Yeah, those don't sound
So
like.
if that was causing confusion, I apologize. What I'm really saying is the rate of increase will go down if we stop consuming fossil fuels. But it won't go away.
Sure, okay.
And every once in a while, you'll hear what I'll characterize as unrealized hopes for dealing with these things. One is carbon capture and sequestration. And you either do it by taking the carbon and other greenhouse gases out of the air and store them. There are ways to do that, but whether you can do that in an energetically attractive way remains unknown. I'm categorizing these as unrealized hopes. If you'll go to Google and look at these topics, you'll find that there's a range of opinion, because there is optimism about things that can be done. But that's my opinion. And also you'll hear proposals for geoengineering, which mean really increasing the albedo of the Earth's atmosphere, either by injecting aerosols in the upper atmosphere or using things like mylar reflectors. The other is increasing the carbon sinks in the ocean by growth of algae, and on land by growth of forests. We'll get back to that. Okay, so I would say that the optimism right now is unjustified, but maybe will lead to better outcomes later. So this is probably the most important slide I'll show you today. For stability, what we have to do is come up with adequate fossil fuel substitutes. We have to really stop using fossil fuels. And we have to, with these replacements, we have to both install them and use them. That is, just identifying them, which is the stage that we're at, doesn't do the job. We have to do it by vastly, we mean on a global scale, but also quickly enough, which I haven't spoken about until now. So the degrees of freedom are basically innovation, coming up with better technologies, investments to change the infrastructure, policies to affect behavior, and international cooperation. And I would say that we're basically making progress on the innovation. On the other things, it's much weaker, but they're all needed in parallel. And the other thing I want to note, and this is controversial, is that market mechanisms are probably not going to do the job. And so if you look at what's been happening in, say, the wealthy countries, because they're the ones who have the money and the authority to make decisions. They're just moving too slowly. And I submit that government leadership, as it says here, are needed in the way that we saw with World War II, where you basically had a strong leader and a recognized need for everybody to pull together. That hasn't come into play. And so if, you know, the American model is that, well, the way you change the way we do things is you come up with better alternatives, and they compete in the marketplace, and the winner gets the benefits and things change. But what we've really seen is that it doesn't work that way. The entrenchment of the fossil fuels is too strong. And so something closer to what we saw in World War II, I think, really needs to be considered, where you have to have a strong leader. And the United States in the last two world wars has played that role. And you have need lots of incentives for cooperation. These right now have not been identified. And so this gives a picture of what might be in the future. This comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the international consortium that volunteers analyses of how things might go in this area. And about every 2 or 3 years, they bring out a consensus document, which basically tells the same story, that the things in the last document are still active, only it's getting worse. And so this is a typical result from their analyses. And they look at the implications, given a particular economic growth scenario, of different policies to affect the emissions from either high growth up here or constant CO2. So you'll note that even if we were to go to constant CO2, that there is an increase in the temperature, as I had said, but not nearly as big as looking to the future. And there's kind of a consensus of having a goal of not letting the temperature increase go above about 2 degrees C. So if you look at the timescales on this, if you accept this analysis, we've got something in the neighborhood of, this started in the year 2000, so from now to the future, we've got something like 50 years to basically cut out reliance on fossil fuels. I would say this urgency is not broadly recognized. I mean, it is in decision-making circles, but in popular circles, I would say it's not. All the things I've said that need to be done have to come within those 50 years. And that's a big challenge. So when we look at what's behind that analysis, this is what the IPCC means, where for the wealthy countries, we're looking at steady output of greenhouse gases, as has been the case for quite a while. In the rapidly developing countries, the wealthy countries involve about 20% of the global population. The rapidly developing ones are about 40%. And this is basically where the problem goes. Mm-hmm. And then you have another 40% of humanity, which is not contributing to the problem because their emissions are staying steady, but they don't have the money to invest in increasing their infrastructure for greater growth. And so if we go back, these rises that you see here are really from the rapidly developing countries, places like China, for example. I don't think anybody has really come up with a means of getting these countries not to contribute more emissions, and because they have the capability, they have the wealth, and they're going to demand their fair share of an improved lifestyle. And for the slowly developing countries, they're not going to have the means. Basically, think of Africa, where the electric infrastructure is very weak, for example. But that's basically what we're looking at. We tend to focus on what happens in wealthy countries because we live in one. But the message here is that we're not actually the heart of the problem. We're contributors, there's no question about that. But we're not the biggest contributors, or likely to be so for quite a while. Also, the Paris Climate Agreement, which the U.S. announced they would abandon, that happened last week, has led to statements of intended nationally determined contributions. This is what different countries say they will try to do. And they usually have a goal, and in some cases they talk about how they're going to meet it, or go into some detail. So these are some from COP21, and we're now coming up on COP30. And that's an annual meeting. And so in India, they have an interesting one. The menu for all these countries is fairly similar, which is that they'll increase the renewable capacity by some tens of percents. They'll go to biomass sequestration of carbon, which you can translate into they're going to plant trees and other things like that. They'll take the carbon out of the atmosphere. The problem with this is that it's a temporary thing. The plants that you grow die, and then they decay, and the carbon comes back into the atmosphere. But for the time being, it's still not a bad thing to do. And everybody goes for improvements in energy consumption efficiency. In China, it's for the U.S., if you go online, you can Google INDCs, and you can get the current statements. For China, their menu is basically the same. The goals are different from country to country, but they're all in sort of the same ballpark. And in China, the only thing that really stands out is that one of their goals is to double the amount of urbanization in their population. I think reflecting the fact that they get more of their people working in factories rather than on farms and creating a lot of biomass that decays, that things might be helped. And for basically every country, you'll find an entry in this, and it changes from year to year. But if you want to learn more about it, Google it, and you'll see what's there. Okay, so what are the decarbonization options? We've spoken about the renewables, and that's basically solar, wind, and biomass. Haven't talked much about nuclear, and implicitly it's nuclear fission, which I'll get to in a minute. But nuclear fusion sometimes comes up as an option as well. And my message about fusion is that it can't be developed fast enough to be useful, which to researchers is a sad story, but I think it's real. And efficiency improvements where you can relax about that, because as everything else plays out, the cost of energy will increase, and that will drive things in the right direction. And we've seen this in the U.S. over the past 50 years. Creation of fossil fuel substitutes for consumption of fossil fuels. The thing to note is that electricity, even in a country like the U.S., is only a fourth of the total. So you've got to find some other way to meet your energy needs. And then I spoke about technology development, where what needs to be done involves more than just one country. The infrastructure replacement I've spoken about, and it demands replacement globally, and it's going to require a lot of money. Right now, that's occurring, but not nearly to the degree that's needed. And a new item is this last one down here, which is to provide incentives for underdeveloping countries, underdeveloped rather, that are rich in resources, but they're less wealthy, and so their ability to do the things needed up here are not great. And so if you look at a country like, let me go back to the INDCs. So, I think that's it. For the underdeveloped countries, their incentives to sell their carbon resources are pretty strong, and you're seeing that, particularly in the Middle East, where most of the countries are petrostates in some way. Russia is a petrostate. And in order to get them not to sell these things, you either have to come up with prohibitions or incentives to do things differently. Right now, we haven't made much progress on that. In fact, we're not even finding incentives to do it internally. And we still can't agree on having a carbon tax, for example. And so this is sort of an unmentioned component of the agenda, but I think it's one that requires some discussion, because basically what you're going to need is money coming from the wealthy countries to make it attractive to the less wealthy countries not to sell their resources. And if you look back here, this is the INDC for India. And you will note that what they say is that what they will do depends on their domestic resources, but also depends on international contributions. And at the time when this was put together, they were looking at roughly $80 billion.
Is that
there are-
one time or per year?
This is overall for how they would try to achieve their goals, but these are all things that you don't really know with much detail. But the argument that they offer is, look, wealthy countries, you're wealthy because you got a lot of resources and help from us. And it's only fair that you help us solve your problem as well as ours. So far, I would say that hasn't gotten a lot of traction, but it's an explicit part of the INDC statement. Okay. So these are some of the resource-rich countries, and I'll try to just identify some where making it attractive not to sell their fuels may be more difficult. India is a good one. China, South Africa, that's for coal. With natural gas, it's again China, Norway. It's not an underdeveloped country, but they're still selling their natural gas from the North Sea. Algeria and Netherlands, they're also developed, but they're continuing to sell. And with petroleum, I would say the big enchilada here is the Middle East. And I didn't even list all the countries. There are about 6 that are important. But also Canada, for example, with their tar sands. Russia, most of their income comes from selling hydrocarbons. Nigeria, Angola, Venezuela, and so on. So that's yet another conundrum that needs to be resolved. And so this is the menu of energy. And the thing to note with the renewables is that some are geographically constrained and inflexible, and others are more flexible. So it depends on whether you can produce your energy from the wind that's blowing over your facility right now, or somehow you can harvest the wind over a broader region. With biomass, it is flexible because you can grow the fuels that are used for biomass and then convert them into fuel later. With nuclear fission, it is geographically unconstrained and flexible and available now. And there are 2 versions that are used, fission of U-235 or plutonium-239. Nuclear energy is actually an important energy source in that there are about 450 nuclear power reactors operating in the world today. And there are even more operating in the oceans, but those are not contributing to the climate change problem. Nuclear energy has not been growing rapidly in the wealthy countries, and they're the ones who mostly have them for several decades. And to give you an example, in the United States, in the past 50 years, we have licensed 2 nuclear power plants. We have the biggest nuclear power economy in the world, but it was all started before 1974. And so effectively, we collectively have decided not to pursue that option. There's a lot of interest, there's always a lot of interest in new things that aren't here right now. And nuclear fusion, where you take light elements and you fuse them into something a little heavier, that is, in this case, forms of hydrogen going to helium with an excess neutron coming out. Right now, the physical problems of developing this look too difficult. And so my observation is it's unlikely to be here on the timescale that I've outlined to you. And then with the related technologies, you need synthetic fuels, something that gets you off of petrochemicals, and you need energy storage. And the things listed here we have, but it's a question of degree because you may need a very large infrastructure, larger than we have right now. So if I'm bringing up things which seem to have a lot of degrees of motion and of flexibility, that's right. And just focusing on innovation in laboratories to produce energy sources is just not going to cut it. That's my basic message. And so if we look at the renewables, some are geographically flexible in the sense that you can put them in a variety of places. You can dispatch the energy. You don't need the sun to be shining, for example, for them to be useful. With the other renewables, they are geographically constrained. That is, you have to put the facility where the original resource is abundant, such as with wind. You know, you put your wind turbines where the wind is blowing. You can extract the energy when the resource is active, but if it's not, nothing's going to happen. So if the wind dies or the sun goes down, the party's over until things change. This is where I would say the greatest interest in response is coming. And so one thing that's attractive to many people with renewables is that they're sort of viewed as being warm and cuddly. And my message is, no, that isn't really true. What they are big and industrial. So I've got a few images to give you a sense of that. So this is for a solar PV facility. This is for concentrating solar. So what you have is an array of mirrors and a boiler on top of a tower. And you direct photons from the sun to the boiler, and you produce some hot fluid, which you can use to extract energy. And so this is one in Spain, to give you an example. And it works. And then you can have large wind farm arrays. This is one for 630 megawatts, which is about half of what you would get from a modern coal-fired or nuclear power plant. And this is near London. And following the 1973 oil embargo, Brazil particularly took a different look at this, and they said, we're not going to be relying on what happens in the Middle East. We're going to have more self-reliance. And so they have gone into biofuels much more than you find in other countries. This is an example of a refinery and surrounding biofuel fields. If you drive a car in Brazil, you go into a gas station, you can choose biofuel or you can choose petroleum fuel. It's the only country that I know offers that, but I've seen it in action. It's real. And then finally, there's nuclear, where for the last half century, we've largely treated it as something that is not all that important for us. And the decision was made to shut down the plant shown here. It's a 2-unit plant in California, Diablo Canyon. But in recent years, there's come to be a realization that California isn't going to be able to meet its energy goals. And so they decided to let it continue to operate. But there's nothing being done to bring more such plants into being. That may change, but that's how it's been. Okay, now this is from the IPCC, and it gives you a comparison of different aspects of energy production, electricity, I should say, in terms of construction materials, mining, transport, etc. And you can read it. And you can see how the different electricity sources stack up in terms of the totals. And so the renewables are here, nuclear is here, and wind in various forms, and solar. They're all kind of down here at the same place. So I would say the technological developments that are occurring as a means of getting us off of fossil fuels are in the right area. It's just a question of whether they can do it strongly enough. So this is a comparison of land use and capacity factor for all the energy sources. And so what you see is nuclear, because of that large energy release per reaction that I mentioned to you, has a natural advantage here. And they are able to come in with very high capacity factors, where being above 90% is typical today. And this is what you get in terms of land use. For solar, it's important, but you see by comparison it's down. For wind, it's also important, but down compared to solar. This is for photovoltaic solar. And then in different countries, when you look at, say, nuclear fission, hydro, and renewables, this is how it compares. These are data from 2018 in different places, but you see that the mix is quite different. So this is South Korea, and they have a very large nuclear economy, and what they do in hydro is much smaller than in other places. So it's a mix from one part of the world to another. And then the last things I'll talk about have to do with nuclear. We've had technology technology lock-in, which means that what we have are light water reactors. These are derived from submarines, because in the early days of the Atoms for Peace program, for political reasons, there was a desire to have a quick success. So somebody said, well, look, let's take a submarine propulsion system, put it on land, connect it to a turbine, and get electricity. And that turned out to be the shipping port reactor. In some countries, there's been a decline, and I've mentioned the U.S. Germany, after the Fukushima event, said that they're abandoning nuclear. Italy did that after Chernobyl. And Japan, they've shut down all their reactors, but they're bringing them back. So about a third of the total are back in operation. But there are other countries which have shown more enthusiasm for it, where France has been the most important, where they get roughly 75% of their electricity from nuclear, and others I'm listing here. And the growth is occurring in East Asia, China, South Korea, India, and so on. I didn't list it here, but the other thing to note is if you want to buy a power reactor today, you basically can buy it from China or from Russia. As a business, this kind of thing has really cooled down from what you would have seen, say, 50 years before. So this is what you see. This is a Russian reactor built at the southern tip of India. There are actually two reactors on this site, but you can only see one. And that's an example of the going to the Russians to buy new ones. This is my list of factors that can determine the degree to which nuclear is used in the future, where I think there's consensus that having a continuing good operational safety record is essential. But you've got to have positive attitudes from the decision makers, and they're listed here. Sometimes there's concern about nuclear weapons proliferation, but so far it hasn't turned out to be a reality. And interestingly, the discussion of nuclear often lists nuclear waste disposal as the most important problem, which from my point of view is stupid. Basically, what you do with nuclear waste is the same thing that you do with any toxic material, which is you isolate it from the biosphere. And this has not turned out to be a problem. But, you know, performance may not meet expectations. And then it will also depend on how people feel about the alternatives and whether nuclear can produce more than electricity, because there's a need, as I've already tried to bring out, for more than electricity. Okay, and that's it. So that's everything that I have to say. What are your questions? Sir?
I think I read recently that there was licensing, multiple licenses given for some modular plants to be used in, probably in the AI industry and some other places, primarily in the South. Are you pretty comfortable with that technology and the things that are going to make it succeed?
The answer is no to your last part.
Because?
The things are against them. I think these small modular things are basically to try to get people to be less frightened by the nuclear plants. And the notion is that if the reactors are small and cuddly, that somehow they won't be as scary as the bigger ones. But the economies of scale all go against that. And if you decide you really want one of these, you're just using the wrong approach. That's my view. Other people will have different views. But it's driven by public relations, not by physical reality. Yes, in the back.
Why did you say that nuclear waste disposal is not a problem?
Well, partly it's because Greenpeace has gone on record saying that they will oppose any solution to the nuclear waste disposal problem. And when the spokesman are pressed about that, they say, look, if we declare that nuclear waste can be dealt with, that will open the door to more nuclear power plants. Now, if you really think that it's the most important problem of nuclear power, there's an inherent inconsistency. What you do, there are a lot of toxic things in life, and radioactive material are just one of them. And what you do with all of them is you sequester them from the biosphere. That can be done. I mean, it has been done. Nuclear power waste sequestration is a variable expense, and that's pretty much why the utilities have not bought it. They don't have to get it to go away. They can simply deal with it by spending money on it. So it's more something of public perception. Nuclear has been so demonized that the rational discussion of its reality has been pretty much lost.
Yeah. A lot of organizations recently have been pushing the concept of electrify everything. The idea is to use electricity in one of its many forms to provide the energy for all of the reactions that you listed as not covered by the electrical sector of our current economy. I could see from your nod that you're familiar with that concept of electrify everything. Could you comment on it?
I think it's silly. Basically, electrifying everything is something that would be impractical, particularly in places which don't have strong electrical economies. Africa is probably the best example. So it's a direction that you'll move into for natural reasons. That is, there are advantages of electrifying more, but it's in doing everything that's where the objection comes. I think if you really look at it, you'll find that there are some activities where it just doesn't make sense to do it that way. But I think it's unavoidable that we will electrify much more than we have done up until now. And we've seen other countries that have done this, say, in transportation. If you go to France, for example, the high-speed trains are electrified. Japan is the same story. That's been around for decades. And so I think we'll see more of it. The thing to remember is this 50-year time window to be successful. You've got to really decide that you're going to make that change and be energetic in doing it. And I just don't see it happening. Yeah.
Thank you.
You gave a very realistic and discouraging overview of the problem and where we are, but how can we possibly try to solve it if the country, including the government, doesn't believe in climate change, and most people in this country are not interested in the whole problem?
Well, you encapsulate the essence of the problem. It's a collective decision-making problem where you've got to have some consensus. And not only in the U.S., but in the rest of the world, you don't have that. Either because they don't have the money to pursue it, or because they felt badly treated in the 18th century or the 19th century, or whatever the reasons are. I think you need something like we've seen in the World Wars, where basically the outcome of World War II was determined by the attack on Pearl Harbor. And that's what led to the unity of the United States, which had largely been indifferent to what happened in Europe until then. And that created the hegemon, and that got the other allies in line, and the fate of Germany was pretty well determined at that point. You need something like that.
Excuse me, what possible event could draw the whole world together in an effort to fight this thing that's happening to the globe?
If we can, but so far, sweet reason hasn't done the job.
Nobody left the door.
I don't like the answer, but I think it's better to know the answer than to just hope for a better one.
On your last bullet point up there, ability of nuclear fission power to produce more than electricity, what are you thinking about there?
Synthetic fuels primarily. Synthetic fuels.
Oh, okay.
Also
process heat, perhaps.
Desalination, yeah, right, those things. It's just that the economics have favored producing electricity because it's a more valuable product.
More portable too.
Yeah, some, yeah.
Unless you can produce synthetic fuels.
Right, that's right. But I agree.
I have a minor technical question that you really didn't touch upon.
Whenever a speaker hears this, he becomes afraid.
Okay. So, CO2 stays in the air for about 100 years.
No more.
More.
More like 10 times or more.
Well, that's sort of getting to my question. Methane stays in the air for 20 years or something. Now, are these half-lives, or they're not nuclear reactions, so
Right.
so
It's chemical.
they don't follow maybe the same physics
Right.
as you might have with nuclear half-lives. But what does that 120 really mean?
Say it again, I'm not getting the 120 part.
Is the 100 years a half-life?
No, it's a time scale.
Is what?
A time scale. Because it depends on chemical reactions with other things. And there isn't just one other thing to react with.
Oh, I see.
Whereas
So,
if we're talking about an isotope, there is a definitive time scale that has to do with the behavior of the nucleus.
and so CO2 may stay in the air then longer than the 100 years. But
Yes.
methane may come out quite quickly after the 20 years, is that right?
That's right. So these are just ballpark numbers.
Yeah. Thank you.
I wonder if you could comment on the pathway that China seems to be pursuing to deal with these issues. They are certainly ramping, in my view, they're ramping up their renewable and pump storage and nuclear capability more rapidly than any other country that I'm aware of. Already they've kind of reached a peak in their use of fossil fuels for electricity production. Whether the peak is last year or this year or the next year isn't clear, but they're close to a peak for that. You were talking about the need for a global leader to lead us. Well, what would you think about China being that hegemon?
You raise a provocative question. We tend to think of something from what I call the free world, and maybe that isn't going to happen this time. To give you an idea of the scale of this, in 1993, Michael Ann and I went to Beijing as guests of the Chinese government because they were thinking about expanding their nuclear activity, not to make it a joke. So I gave some lectures on the experience in the U.S. and where there might be some lessons. And after that, they took off, not necessarily because of anything I told them, but they took, it's a symptom of how they had been kind of asleep at the switch until they decided to pay attention to it. And when they got the right encouragement, they really took off. And one of the things I always tell our students is when the Chinese say they're going to do something, you should better believe that they're going to do it. And I've got plenty of non-nuclear examples that I can bring up for that as well. So they could play that role. Their ability to serve as a hegemon or a leader may be more limited for cultural reasons, but who knows? But it's an alternative to the U.S. They and South Korea are the ones growing fastest, and Russia is not growing so fast, but they're a reliable supplier. So for future reactors, those are the places where you might call first. You wouldn't do it in the U.S. There's no natural candidate for that. And that's true actually in the former nuclear countries like in Western Europe and so on. So I hope that gives an answer.
Thank you.
Sir.
Oh.
Question on, it seems that in the United States and much of Western Europe, the word nuclear has been added pretty much to the list of four-letter obscenities. Would you care to comment on, given that it could be a very important player in dealing with energy crisis, any thoughts on how to overcome this kind of profound fear and hostility toward nuclear power?
If I had a glib answer, I would provide it. The thing, it's always tempting to come across as a nuclear zealot in response to questions like this. But I would say the real answer is that until recently, nuclear has not been important. That following World War II, there was an optimism about technological innovation and how that was going to lead to new things. And you might remember, I think it was 1954, Eisenhower was the president that announced the Atoms for Peace program. It's an international program to be led by the U.S., but he did it at the UN as a broad thing. And there was enthusiasm for that until 1963. And that's when the Vietnam War got going. My view is that's when the enthusiasm for nuclear went away. Because there were a lot of people who were very unhappy about the war itself, and they were unhappy about the leadership. And criticism of the nuclear program was a way of attacking the leadership quality overall. And that was when the decline occurred. The last new reactors, except for two, were ordered before 1974. So I don't have an answer to your question, because you're asking, how could it change? We've got to have a reason for people to think that it should change.
Yeah, I think I remember as a youngster visiting the first open house at the Enrico Fermi fast breeder site in Monroe, Michigan, and listening to the presentation about the potential of that technology, which are, of course, our friends, the French, have been able to deal with recycling used fuel, extracting the plutonium, and using that in their reactors. And yet we throw away perfectly good recyclable fuel because of some irrational fear of handling it.
Okay, let me say something about that. First of all, France has gone away from recycle because it's expensive. It's not any big technical problem because uranium is not so rare. So getting new fuel for your next reload is not that difficult. But because they don't have indigenous resources, they wanted to have an independent degree of freedom, so they built the capacity to do that. It's just that over time, their worries about scarcity of nuclear fuel not went away, but certainly became less. The other thing is that following the Vietnam-related criticisms, people came to understand if we didn't build nuclear, we'll still be fine. We're going to get our electricity, and the prices won't go up like crazy. And so the whole interest in the nuclear enterprise, I would say, became much more muted. If that were to change, I could see things coming back. The last thing I want to say is that basically, except for the Chernobyl accident, for civilian nuclear power, nobody has been seriously hurt or killed. But it seems to not make a difference in the perception and so on. But it's real.
Is that true worldwide or just U.S.?
Let me think about it for a minute. I would say worldwide, but I have to put in some quibbles. There were 3 fatalities associated with the Fukushima Daiichi event. Those were not caused by radiation. The World Health Organization did an analysis, and they said basically radiation did not play an important part. And I focus on that because that's usually the thing that drives the concern. One guy was hit by a crane ball within the power plant, caused by the motion of the earth. Another guy had a heart attack, and I don't remember the third. There were 3 fatalities at Fukushima. but not due to radiation. It's scary, but in fact, the way it's been managed, it hasn't hurt anybody. So, you know, I'm trying to be careful walking on eggshells, not to come across as in love with my favorite hobby. That's a
But do you know of any studies of the relative effects of the operational safety record of nuclear plants versus other things, coal plants, natural gas plants, green power?
I don't want to say that I know. Basically in nuclear plants, but I would say also in these other industrial facilities, you get the healthy worker effect. So where you might expect to see degraded health outcomes, you don't see it. These people are making pretty good salaries, they're living good lives, and their fatality rates and other health rates are favorable compared to the general population.
Well, I was thinking about the effects of air pollution from coal plants, for example, and the effects of radiation exposure, particularly at Chernobyl. But I think that we cannot expect to have a perfect safety record from any of these things.
Yeah, I was trying to answer a different question.
Yes.
Netflix has a very good show that I can recommend on the Chernobyl accident, where there were at least 32 people killed. They were firefighters mostly. And there may be many more because of off-site releases. You don't know. The data are just not there.
Right.
So safety in any facility depends on both the technology and the culture in which it's implemented. And has anybody here had experience in Russia? What can you say about their attitude towards safety?
I don't know. We were there in 2010, and
That's reason to know.
well, safety about,
Never mind, let me
Yeah, sorry.
end the agony. I would say that they're very casual. The rules are treated as
oh,
being
yes,
advisory.
about a lot of things.
And that accounted a lot for what happened in Chernobyl. Outside of the former Soviet Union, where they had some bad things happen also in their weapons program, the safety record is pretty good. So I don't think this is really about actuarial outcomes, but more about images or fears that are exciting. But, you know, I keep saying, and I've been telling my wife this for years, when nuclear has been going through a doldrums, and I was doing other things too, so I didn't have to depend on this so much, but when climate change becomes really serious, nuclear is going to come roaring back. And I tell my students this. And so the question is, do I get out of the way and let the Renaissance begin, or do I hang on to be part of the party? And so far, I hung on in a small way. I don't know if that answers your question, but I got going on Netflix, and I want to really recommend this. They have a docudrama on the Chernobyl events, and I thought it was pretty good. So if you want to get a different view on that, it could be worth looking at. And as far as the consequences of Chernobyl, the numbers vary between the low 30s and the low thousands. The data just aren't there. And that's all we can say. In the Western world, or the non-Soviet world, we really haven't had that problem. That's all. Anybody else? Have we done enough?
Very much.